Hello, everybody. Welcome. Come on in. Good to see everyone. Nice to see some folks already joining us. This is a good time if you're on and you know somebody who is interested in these kinds of topics. Feel free to share on your social media if you're comfortable. And we'll get some more people to join us. Always good to have a nice crew for our discussions. Keep coming in. Say hi in the comments. I don't know if you're on. If you don't say hi, I can't tell otherwise who joins. So come on in, say hello, and we'll get started shortly. Let's see who we have on. Hello, Jared Noble. Good to have you on, my friend, always. Hello, Beulah is on. Donna Bursey is on. Good to have you on, Donna. Donna's always encouraging. Jenna Lee is on. Jenna Lee is also wishing that her 5-year-old would go to bed. I'd say you're not alone in that, probably. Patsy is on. Lynn is on out in Lloydminster. Good to have you on. Glenda is on in St. John's. Great to have you. Hello, Harvey Conway. Sharon Rogers is on in Gander. Gloria is on in Cornerbrook. Roddy is on. Good to have you on, Roddy. Paul Simpson, good evening to you as well. Sherry is out in Botwood. Good to have you on. Lawrence and Kathy Pilgrim are on. Good to have you on. George and Shirley are up on Burntberry Pond, where it should be just lovely this evening. My sister is watching in the airport in Montreal. Hope you're having a good flight back from the sunny south. Marilyn is out in the Philippines. Good to have you on, Marilyn. Wonderful. Larry is on. Larry and Nina out in PEI. See who else we have on. Rod Boone. Yep. Hello, Martin. Martin is having similar troubles as Jen Lee, hoping to get a 6-year-old to go to sleep. You're not alone, Martin, my friend. Hello, Jacqueline. Good to have you on. Kathy is on. Keep coming in, folks. Say hi in the comments, and I'll know you're on. And we'll get started in just a second. Take some time and invite a few people. Get your snacks ready. Always good to have a few snacks. You know, can't hurt. Have a little lunch while we're doing this kind of thing. Let's see who else we have. Carol Williams is on. My darling wife is on directly below me downstairs. She'll have a snack ready when I get done, I'm hoping. Hello, Joyce out in Appleton. Shirley is in PEI. Hello, Kayla. Good to have you on. Hi, Mark, my buddy. Hope you're doing great. Been a long time since Mark was in my youth group, and he survived it. Riley is on. Wade Priddle's out in Sarnia, Ontario. Beautiful spot. Elaine is on. Les and Margaret in beautiful PEI. Ruth Poole is on. Good to have you on, Ruth. James and Kelly Lander are on. Good friends. Always good to have you folks on with us. James has been on the show a number of times. Ruby Edison, good to have you on. Sonia is out in Fort Mac. Great to have you with us. Mark Roberts is good evening. Says good evening to the Worksias. So that's a wide good evening to everybody. Keep coming in. I'm just going to make a note here. It's good to have everybody. This beautiful Sunday evening, the 15th of May. It started off here in central Newfoundland. Cold. I think Melinda left this morning to go to Botwood. It was 2 degrees and it really wanted to snow a bit. But by the time supper came around, it was sunny. We hit all of 12 degrees, I'd say. So that's capping off a pretty good week we've had here. Not bad, you know, that's how it goes in May for us. Dwayne Anstey is not at all gloating about the fact that he is in Florida. He is very humbly giving thanks to the Lord for his good fortune tonight. So good on you, Dwayne, sir. Elsie is up in Nain. Good to have you on. Always good to have folks from the big land. Elsie is on. Hazel Willie Breton. Good to have you folks on. As always. Annette is in Springdale, and she's looking forward to seeing Ryan Ball, who's going to join me in a minute. Great to have you on. Well, we are going to get started tonight. Let's see, there we go. We are going to do three things tonight. We are going to talk a little bit about abortion from a Christian perspective, or at least from my Christian perspective, because it's a widely debated topic, as you know. We are going to talk some about truth and grace and the way that believers perceive that. And then at the end, we are going to talk some about lessons for the post-pandemic church. And I think that's going to be an interesting segment for many of you. My good friend Ryan Ball is going to join us. He's pastoring in Rocky Harbor, and he's got some good insights on this, I think. And so as we kind of change gears, I wanted to really size up where we've been in terms of the pandemic and where we might be going. So we're going to have some conversation around that. I don't know how long we'll be tonight, but of course I never know, how that goes. Deepest condolences to all of the Leafs fans. I'm not all that much into hockey, but I know that some of you are really into hockey, especially into your Leafs. And I love to tell people that if Christians had the kind of faith that Maple Leafs fans have, you could be raising the dead on a regular basis. I tell you what. So another heartbreaking loss in round 7, in game 7 last night to get out of round 1. Thanks to everybody who have been kind enough to get a copy of my latest book. Let me put myself back up here. Here it is here. Tinder, Tattoos, and Tequila. Many of you have written to say, to give me your impressions of it, your feedback. You've been very kind and generous, and I appreciate that. If you have read it, if you've gotten through it, I would appreciate it. Love to see you write a review on Amazon. Even just rate it. The publisher tells me that's very helpful. So if that comes to your mind and you're able to do that, that would be most appreciated. This is going to be our last show for the season, since we're into the middle of May and the evenings are nice and long and people are out about. This is, by my count, my 51st show since, when did I start? April 27th, 2020. So in 2 years or so now, this is my 51st. So we're going to do this one tonight and then take a break for the summer. I may or may not come back in the fall. We'll let the Spirit lead on that one. I will say to you, though, that there is a pile of teaching available on YouTube. And just this week, somebody wrote me and asked if I had done anything on cremation. And in fact, there is a video there on cremation on the YouTube channels, just under Bradley Truman Noel, my 3 names. There is somebody else wrote me this week and wanted to know if there was anything on yoga. And I had one there on that. So basically anything, man, I did 50 topics in short segments. So there is a whole pile of stuff available there. So by all means, check out the YouTube channel. And I think you will find that helpful. There's every topic I could think of when I was doing those short 4 to 8 minute segments are there. So that's where we're headed tonight. Let's see. Good to have Barbara on, and Lonnie, and Dale is on. Donna, this is very kind. Thank you, Donna. I haven't missed a show. Best thing on the internet. Well, I'm afraid that's not setting the bar real high, given what's on the internet these days. But here we go anyway, for show number 51. Let's see. I'm going to start off with... that's where I'm going to start with grace and truth. Now, this is an interesting conversation, as you may know. We get lots of feedback on this one, and people are very interested in the whole conversation around grace and truth. And it comes, of course, from John 1, and it's a great passage of scripture. This is the 4th gospel. John starts off the most lofty, as it were, of all the gospels. Mark is a real action guy. Luke, and he's very brief. Mark's favorite word is and next, and then Jesus did this and this and this. Matthew is writing largely to the Hebrews. Luke, the Gentile physician, is really the gospel of the Holy Spirit. And John kind of captures it all together. And John probably starts off with the highest, what we'd call Christology. John starts off with a very high statement about Jesus as Christ, as God. In the beginning, as you'll know this verse, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And he uses the Greek idea there of the logos, which is the greatest conceivable, it's really hard to explain to you here, the greatest conceivable force or the greatest conceivable idea in philosophy is the logos. And that's what he says, in the beginning was the logos. And he's trying to show folks how Jesus is the consummation of everything they had hoped for and imagined, even philosophically and intellectually. And of course, he says, through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that was made. He talks about himself. There came a man sent from God. His name was John. He came as a witness. He says, Jesus came to his own, but his own didn't receive him. And then he goes on, and after he says that, but to as many as received him, he gave the right or the power, the dunamis, to become the sons of God. He says this, the Word became flesh and lived among us for a while. He literally tabernacled, or he set up his tent among us. And so he's going there. He's starting from, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning, right on down to say he actually set up his tent and lived among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. So that's John 1, 1-14. It's hard to find a book of the Bible with a more powerful beginning than that. And so this is what John does. He says this, as Jared says here, the first of first principles is the Logos. Here is the greatest conceivable first principle, the greatest thing in the universe. He was with God, he was God, but he's now come and he's pitched his tent among us. And we have beheld his glory. We've seen him in the flesh. He's lived among us. And he came full of grace and truth. Now, Jesus is our model when we want to talk about grace and truth. I find a couple of things, and my thoughts are maybe on this a little bit scattered because there's a whole lot I'd like to say. But I find a couple of things. One is that people tend to think of grace, truth as a continuum going in opposite directions, or they're juxtaposed in the sense that if you have a lot of grace, you don't have very much truth, but if you've got a lot of truth, you don't have very much grace. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Jesus came full of grace and truth. He never came to model one or the other. He came to show us how to have 100% truth and 100% grace. So it's not like you're trying to accomplish one or the other. We are called to be full of grace and people who are full of truth. But I find that when we get talking about this, Christians, and I understand it, and I'm going to unpack it in a minute a little bit. Christians seem to fall in one of two camps. There's a lot of folks today, and I would be one of these, to be quite honest with you, who'd say, you know, we've had so much judgment and we've had so much condemnation in the church from people lobbing truth bombs, as it were, at folks, that what we need now is really grace. We need more grace. We need more grace for people, more grace. And I totally get that. The church culture I grew up in, like many of you, was fairly harsh towards people. It was, one second there, really harsh towards people. It was really a lot of judgmentalism. a lot of condemnation. There was a very strict holiness code. And if you fell outside of that, well, it never served you very well. A lot of kids will talk about, and they're not kids now, they're my age, 50. Will talk about having been driven out of the church, or they felt driven out of the church because their hair was too long, or they got a tattoo, or one thing or another. And so you compare all of that, and you say, you know what we need now is a lot more grace for people. On the other hand, now, of course, are the folks who say, well, we've had a period of some grace now, and where it seems to have led is that anything goes. So, yes, in our history, many of us come out of the holiness movement. We were pretty judgmental, but now it seems that you can live any way you want, and you can participate in lifestyles that were one time considered unacceptable for Christians. We have all kinds of different social values now, and there are many among us who say what we need now is more truth. We need to stand up for the truth again. And I get that as well. So let me see if I can unpack that a little bit. The standing up for the truth piece seems to me to be something that we were used to doing as the church, because we were, and you've heard me talk about this, we were in Christendom, which means that the church and the state were closely joined, and the churches were kind of like the chaplains of culture. So not only did we disciple and pastor those who actually attended worship, we felt the need to broadcast our values and to teach all of society and culture our ways and what was right and what was wrong. That's an interesting piece, and I'm sure many of you still see it that way. I'm not sure I see it that way. I don't see Paul in general writing in the New Testament teaching the Roman Empire how it should live. He's teaching the churches. He's writing to the church at Galatia or Corinth or Thessalonica, and he's saying, here's how you should live. But even when Paul, and a great example, if you want some sense of how the truth works here, Peter in Acts 2 addresses the Jews who have come, and they're outside the day of, they're listening to what's happening on the day of Pentecost. And Peter says, basically, this Jesus is the Messiah, and he traces Old Testament history for them. And he says, you've killed him, but God's risen him from the dead. And if you believe on him, you'll be saved, you and your household. Because he's talking there to the church. But when you get Paul in Acts 17 on Mars Hill, where he is at the gate or the town square where all of the philosophers would gather to talk about ideas, you see a very, very different approach. You see him saying, hey, you have an altar here to the unknown God. I'm going to explain to you who that unknown God is. And he gives a little bit of history. He competes, as it were, in the marketplace of ideas. And he says, you people have a lot of gods, but you're so careful, you're so honest to say there might be one we've missed, so we have an altar to the unknown God, just in case. He says, I'm gonna introduce you to that unknown God. It's a very, very different approach. And I think sometimes that the people who are yelling the loudest, we need more truth, we need to tell culture how to live, they imagine that all of culture is still Christianized. They imagine that they're doing what Peter was doing in Acts 2, which is talking to God's people. He is talking to the Jews. I'm not sure that you can draw that equivalence today. In fact, Canada is now in a post-Christendom phase for certain. And what we're doing now is far more like Acts 17. We are one of many ideas out there. We are one religion of many. We are one philosophy of many. We are probably in the minority, even though the country itself has a pretty strong Christian memory. And even though there are vestiges, there are remnants of Christianity, the idea that we get a stat holiday on Easter and Christmas. By and large, the country has moved on. And so now we are a voice among many voices. And we are really doing now for folks what Paul was doing in Acts 17. We are saying basically, of all the gods out there, we'd like to introduce you to ours. So in terms of proclaiming truth to culture, I think we have to approach it very much differently than we might have done even 50 years ago. I don't think yelling at culture and shaming them, I don't think condemning culture for not living like Jesus followers is working. It hasn't worked in 50 years. We have a long history of expecting people who've never signed up to follow Jesus, we expect them to live by Christian ethics. And that just doesn't make sense. And I understand it's difficult because, like I say, we're in a shift from having lived in Christendom to post-Christendom. And so now that culture has really walked away in many ways from all things Christian, many of us still think like we're in the 1960s and we want to straighten culture out and we want to stand up for the truth and all of this type of stuff. And I'm not sure that's the way to do it. Now, certainly in the church, we ought to be standing up for the truth. But as we go back, so let me circle back around. So that's the piece for the folks who say we need more truth. We need more truth. I think they think that they're preaching to a culture that's even receptive. By and large, our culture is not receptive to Christian truth unless you're doing so out of relationship. They don't anymore honor authority. They don't respect your title as a pastor. So, I mean, if you're a pastor and you think you're going to straighten culture out in terms of how it's living, if they don't know you or know who you are, they don't really give two hoots what you got to say. You're just one voice out of many. And if you're a judgmental, angry voice, they really don't care what you have to say. In fact, you're probably just doing a disservice to the gospel. So, that's the truth piece. So I'm going to park that there and then come back to it in a minute. But let's look at the grace piece, because Jesus Christ came full of grace and truth. Now, in my mind, of course, he modeled this perfectly. I struggle with it, as you probably struggle with it. Some of us, we like to lead with grace, as it were, or we lead with truth. I sense Jesus did all things very, very well. But I would say that in many situations, Jesus led, as it were, with grace. So it's kind of like if I meet somebody or I'm doing ministry or one thing and another, yeah, you can be full of grace and truth. And I understand that they're not polar opposites. That's why I started off by saying this. But my sense is sometimes Jesus led with one over the other. And by leading with grace, he taught truth. So I think of Luke 5 and see one of the challenges we have with the scriptures these days is that the last pages in this book were written, 1900 years ago, a little more. And there's a whole pile of cultural things. The truth in here is the same, but we miss a lot of it because there's a lot of cultural references. So for one, Jesus led with grace when he called Levi, who's Matthew. And all we know is that he was a tax collector. You've probably heard me talk about this here on the show before. He was a tax collector, and Jesus went along and he's calling disciples, and he looks at Levi at his booth there and he says, "Come follow me." And we don't think anything more than that about it. We picture Levi. Give me 1 second here. A little technical adjustment. We picture Levi as a guy who's an accountant with a pocket protector in and a pen, and he works for Canada Revenue Agency. And Jesus called an accountant, and we go, no big deal. See, that could not be further from the truth. Tax collectors were absolutely hated and despised in Israel because the tax collector was somebody who worked for the occupying power. You see, Palestine in Jesus' time was occupied by Rome, the same way that Russia is occupying parts of Ukraine today. It was not free. It was ruled from afar by a foreign power. Now, when you hear so many people screaming about our political process today and all of this type of stuff, and they somehow equate that to Jesus, you have to remember Jesus lived in occupied times, in occupied territories, and in reality talked precious little about the Romans. Okay, that's the first thing to think about. Levi would have worked for these occupying Romans. He would have collected taxes from Jews on behalf of the Romans. So to picture today, picture you have your Ukrainians who are collecting taxes in Ukraine on behalf of the Russians. You can just imagine how despised they are. Well, Jews would not accept the testimony of a tax collector in court, because they believed they were liars. They taught that if you were a tax collector, your children were corrupted to the third generation. Jews would not accept the tithe of a tax collector. Now, I've been in church all my life, and I don't know anyone that Pentecostals wouldn't take a tithe from. But they would not take tithes from tax collectors. I mean, they were the lowest of the low. And so Jesus goes out of his way to see Levi, this traitor, really, and he shows him grace. That's how he leads off. He doesn't judge him. He doesn't lead with the truth that you're being a traitor to your people. He says, I want you to come follow me. And if you ever watch a movie on this, if it's a movie worth its salt, the disciples that are there already, Peter and the others, will be shocked that Jesus is called a tax collector. Over and over again in the Gospels. And I want you to watch for this phrase when you're reading through the Gospels: the tax collectors and sinners, tax collectors and sinners, tax collectors and sinners. That's how they are always referred to. And so again, to take a story of Zacchaeus, and all we know about Zacchaeus is that he was a short little fellow who lived in a tree. And we know that from the Sunday school song. And Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector. He had tax collectors working under him. So they were ripping people off. Like a tax collector could literally, I don't know how to explain this to you. He could wander around your local mall. If you're in Newfoundland, you'll be in the Avalon Mall or in Costco, and he'd see you coming out with your 4 big bags of groceries, and he could say, I'll take one of them for Rome and one of them for me. And there was nothing you could do about it. He would levy a tax right on the spot, and he could rip you off. I mean, these were despised folks, and that's who Jesus called as a follower, as a disciple. That's leading with grace. That's really leading with grace. And in the leading with grace, he taught a truth, and the truth is that nobody is beyond God's grace. You go to somewhere like John 4, and this is a favorite story of so many of us, where Jesus is talking with a Samaritan woman. And again, the background comes into play here. Jews would not walk through Samaria, and this has to do with the exile, when the Jews were exiled as punishment, and they went off for decades and longer. And the Samaritans never. And they were just north of Israel, Samaria, and they began to worship differently. They were left behind during the exile, and they were so hated by the Jews by the time of Jesus that one of the common nicknames for them was dogs. Jesus actually says that when a Samaritan woman comes to him. He says, it's not right to take the children's bread and give it to the dogs. And Jews would not walk through Samaria. They would not eat Samaritan food. If they happened to tread in Samaritan territory, when they got back out in Israel, they would clap the dust off their sandals so as not to track any of the dirty Samaritan dirt into Israel. That's how bad it was. So Jesus is in Samaria. That's the story in John 4 is wonderful. He's in Samaria. It says his disciples went into the town to buy food. That's a part we miss because Jews wouldn't eat Samaritan food. John 4 starts off by saying Jesus had to go through Samaria. He never actually had to because they used to walk around it up through Galatia. But Jesus was compelled by the Spirit. He meets a woman, and Jewish men, let alone a Jewish rabbi, would never stop and talk to a single woman ever. She's there in the middle of the day, and the reason she's there in the middle of the day is because she is sexually working through all of the men of the town. She's on her 6th husband. And of course, if you're like that, you're not going to be real popular at the 6th hour early in the morning when the women go to draw water in the cool of the day. You don't want to be there because they hate you. So you come at noon. Nobody draws water at noon because it's the hottest part of the day. And she's there alone, and that's why she's there alone, because she's despised. And Jesus begins a conversation with this Samaritan woman. It's just loaded up, the fact that she's a Samaritan and a woman, and he's a Jewish rabbi. And the Bible says, and his disciples were surprised to find him talking to this woman. This, in our culture, for holiness folks, this is the same as if she was a Muslim who was transgender or something. Like it's just, you can't imagine to the first century Jew how shocking it would have been to have Jesus talking to a Samaritan woman. But again, what you should notice if you read that story is that Jesus doesn't judge her. He has a conversation with her. And in fact, you go through John 4, she tries to bait him several times. Your fathers say you must do this, but our people say this. And Jesus never really gets into that argument with her. Even when he says to her, go call your husband, and she says, I don't have a husband. He says, you're quite right. He said, you've had 5, and the man you're with now is not your husband. And there's no judgment to that. He's just stating a fact, and he's using that bit of prophetic insight to let her know he knows what he's talking about. And what's powerful about that story is that he stays there 3 days, and she goes to the people of the town and says, come meet the man who's changed my life, who's told me all about my life. And many, many Samaritans believed on him through the woman, not from him. In other words, he shows grace to the woman at the well, and the Samaritan woman wins Samaritans, which is, by the way, the model for evangelism we're supposed to be following today. Again, Jesus doesn't lead there with truth as we imagine it. He doesn't start off by saying, you're a sinful woman, you're a Samaritan, you should know how to worship better than this. You should certainly adjust your lifestyle sexually and all of this. He starts off by saying, will you get me a drink? He actually treats her with dignity and respect, even though many in her own community, and certainly the Jews of Israel, would not have even spoken to her, even acknowledged her presence. He begins a human interaction with her. He leads with grace. I think also of a fascinating story in Luke 7, where Luke tells us that a sinful woman, or a woman with a sinful lifestyle, and it'd be a great teaching to unpack sometime, she comes to Jesus and she begins to weep, and she anoints his feet, and she wipes it off with her hair. Now, that's a really incredibly interesting story. I'll read a little bit of it to you. One of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, so he went to the Pharisee's house and he reclined at the table. You may know that in those times you didn't sit with table and chairs. The table was kind of a foot off the ground, and you leaned on one elbow, and your body went along by the table, and the next person reclined next to you and next to you in like fashion. When a woman who had lived a sinful life in that town learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster jar of perfume, and as she stood behind him at his feet weeping because he's led out, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. Now, that's actually a very sensual scene, as it were. You have a woman who's known for having what the Bible euphemistically calls a very sinful lifestyle, okay? And she begins weeping, and she's kneeling at Jesus' feet, and her tears are on his feet. She anoints his feet, and then she begins, the Bible says, she wipes his feet with her hair and kisses them and pours perfume on them. I can guarantee you most Jewish rabbis are not that comfortable with that happening. But for Jesus, this is not at all a sensual scene in any way, although I'm sure that's how the Pharisee would have pictured it, because he had this picture of her only as a sinful woman. And when she comes to do this, he doesn't understand what's happening there. Jesus sees this as a woman who is brokenhearted and who is in repentance and who weeps and is showing him love and adoration. And he doesn't chastise her about her lifestyle. He doesn't tell her off. He's not judgmental. He actually begins with a parable for Simon, who's the Pharisee who invited him. And he said, he tells the Pharisee about a guy who owed $1,000 and a guy who owed $10. And when they're both forgiven their debt, who do you think loved more? Who do you think was more grateful? And of course, the person who was forgiven most. And he said, you see this woman? I came into your house. You didn't give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You didn't give me a kiss, but this woman from the time I entered has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not pour oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, for she has loved much. But he who has been forgiven little loves little. And Jesus says to her, your sins are forgiven and your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Again, even though she's a woman of questionable lifestyle, at least according to Luke, Jesus receives her worship, because that for her is an act of worship, and he treats her with grace. And the last one I'd like to mention before I shift gears a little bit is the prodigal son. And this is a story, one of three in Luke 15, where he talks about the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost son. And all three of these are designed to help people understand what God is like. God is like someone who will sweep a house clean because they've lost a coin. God is like someone who will go and leave the 99 for the one who's lost. God is like the father who, even though the son committed the terribly embarrassing and rude act of asking for his inheritance before his own father was dead. I mean, that's like going to your dad and saying, listen, I know you haven't kicked off yet, but if you'd give me whatever I've got coming to me now so I could leave, that'd be great. In other words, you can't wait for him to die. Could you please just give it to me now? I mean, even today, that would be rude. And that story also loads up with things that we miss. It has him in a foreign country, of course, and pigs for Jews were totally off limits. And it has him naturally feeding pigs. And it says he blew his money on what we might call a less than godly lifestyle. And eventually he's starving to death because even the pigs are getting better feed. And he says, I'm going to go home and beg my father to become one of his servants. And remember, the whole point of that story is to show people what God is like. And what God is like, the Bible says, even when he was a long ways off, his father ran. And some of you would have heard Judah Smith teach on this. The most mind-blowing thing in all of this story for the Jewish listeners that we miss today is that the father ran, because Middle Eastern fathers never ran anywhere. It was undignified. You had, especially wealthy ones like this guy, you had long flowing robes. You sat a lot. You were tended on a lot. You never ran anywhere. But this father ran towards this ungrateful, rebellious son. And again, I have to remind you, Jesus is telling this story to say, this is what God is like. You have the God who runs. He runs towards this embarrassment of a son. You have a God who sweeps the house clean looking for the lost coin. You have a God who leaves the 99 to go find the one who's missing. That's what God is like, God who runs. Again, in the Father, in that story, there is no judgment. He doesn't say, you ungrateful brute. He doesn't say anything about repaying him. All he says basically is, go kill the fattened calf, get a robe for the kid, get a ring for his finger, which is a sign of authority. The only one who has a trouble is the older brother who never left, which Jesus uses as a symbol of the church, really. They are upset because this rotten sinner, this rebellious kid, is getting such wonderfully gracious treatment. So, if you want to take Jesus as a model as full of grace and truth, and I believe he was, what I wanted to say tonight is that every time Jesus runs into somebody who's marginalized or messed up or sinful or pushed aside or forgotten, or even the people who have screwed it all up themselves, like this son, the prodigal son, he always leads with grace. He always leads with grace. And the grace he leads with tells the truth that God's heart is always for the broken and the marginalized and the one who has been pushed outside. So that's Jesus. If you want Jesus as your model, that's how Jesus leads with grace. Now, there are times that Jesus leads with truth. And, the only time I was thinking about this, the only time Jesus really lines somebody up, because when I hear people, and sometimes I hear pastors say, we need to speak the truth more, we need to tell the truth. First of all, that doesn't usually mean that we're preaching about any sins that we're fond of or committed. That never means we're going to talk about gossip. That never means we're going to talk about pride. Never certainly means we're going to talk about gluttony. That always means we're going to talk about sexuality, or it means we're going to talk about alcohol, or some of the social issues that the church views we've gotten slack on. That's usually what that means. I'm certainly not talking about our own sins. We don't really want the truth preached then. The time that Jesus really leads with truth is in Matthew 23. And it's when he's confronting the Pharisees at the temple. And he starts off multiple times by saying, "Woe to you, Pharisees and teachers of the law. Woe to you, woe to you." And there's a clip that I've posted from time to time in a movie that captures it well. By the end of it, he's literally screaming at them. He is so passionate about this. And he says things to them like, "You will travel over land and sea to make a single convert, but when you do, you make them twice as much of a son of hell as you are." He calls them a brood of snakes. He really goes after them. He says, you tie up enormous burdens to lay on people's shoulders, but you won't lift a finger to help them. You put on the big show about your giving and all of that, and in reality, you give nothing to the kingdom. It's all a show. He calls them whitewashed tombs and empty sepulchres. Like he says, you look good, you've dressed up for the people and everything on the outside, but inside you're rotten. Woe to you, woe to you, woe to you. And so I think, about all of the folks who say, "Yeah, we really need to speak the truth again." The only time Jesus does that is to the religious folks. When he meets Levi on the desk there as the tax collector, when the woman is anointing his feet with her tears and with oil, when he meets the Samaritan woman, when he's describing God in the parable of the prodigal son, he's starting with grace. He's starting with grace, always starting with grace. But when he's had just about enough of religious people getting in the way of the marginalized coming to know the truth of Christ and the truth of the kingdom of God and the truth of the love and the grace and the mercy of God, that's when he really leads with truth. So I think to sum up there in terms of the truth and grace continuum, that discussion, if you want to be really like Jesus there, then you're going to lead with grace when it comes to the marginalized. And the truth is something that the church should really be speaking to each other. Any thoughts on that or questions? That was quite the sermon on that topic. but it's something I'm often hearing. We need, and it's like we need to be hammering people with the truth. We need to be hammering people with the truth. Yeah, if you want to be like Jesus, full of grace and truth, then you lead always with grace when you meet the broken. But every now and then the church needs a good heavy dose of truth, which is what Jesus does in Matthew 23. Hello to a pile of people that have come in late. Good to have Keith on. Raquel Perry is on. Good to have you. Hello, Amy. Yes, good to have you on. Tony Curtis and Kim. My dear Aunt Penny, my dear Aunt Florence, Penny Peaton is on. Amy, on the flip side, how do we treat those who are Christians and admit their sins? I bet we don't feel like we run to them in love. No, we've not done a good job at that, unfortunately. We're getting better. There's more grace in the church now, I think, than there has been in a while. But the younger generations tends to find the church very fake. And one of the reasons for that is that we grew up in a holiness environment. And there was so much judgment if you admitted that you sinned that everybody pretended they were doing well. And there created a lot of fakeness there. And this generation, thankfully, is leading us back to, they're really leading us back to more authenticity and more transparency. And I'm really grateful for that. Hello, Danny. Good to have you on. And Ruth Burt. Thank you, Cindy, for that. Dwight, some people will see leading with grace as the extreme you mentioned earlier. That is accepting anything, even accepting sin. No, Jesus, he managed to accept people. He managed to reach out to Levi and the Samaritan woman and all of that. And it wasn't accepting the sin, but it was accepting them as a broken person who needs help. And we've got to figure out how to do that. We really do have to figure out how to do that. That's a great question, Dwight. Thanks for that. So anyway, keep coming with the comments there and questions on grace and truth if you have any. I'm going to switch out and talk about abortion now for a couple of minutes. I'm going to get Ryan Ball on in probably 20 minutes or so, and you'll want to hear what he's got to say. Christians and abortion, topic number 2. This is another one of these heavy topics, another one of these very emotionally charged topics for sure. I've seen, you actually get it on social media now, the idea that men should have nothing to say about abortion, and I kind of categorically reject that. I know why they say that, but there are truth claims around abortion, like other things, that are true or are false, regardless of your gender. So I think we can all talk about abortion. I've elsewhere I've done abortion. You can go to YouTube and find it there as a topic. The Bible doesn't talk a lot explicitly about abortion. There's some mention in the Old Testament law, and you can look that up about what happens if a woman is caused to miscarriage through violence. We do know God has appreciation for and knowledge of the unborn. The Psalms talks about us being knit together in our mother's womb. Both Jeremiah and Paul say, I was called from my mother's womb, from before birth. God says, I knew you when I called you. So the Bible clearly teaches that God is aware of us, even in our mother's womb, to the point where he's called us from before birth when we're growing there in the womb. And I'm doing this a little quickly here. You'll see where I'm going in a minute. On the topic of abortion, I think this is one of these things from the New Testament perspective, that the New Testament doesn't really need to talk about abortion per se, in the sense that it does give plenty of principles by which we can think through and discuss abortion. And so even though Paul doesn't write anything about abortion directly, The overriding ethic of the New Testament is not that we seek our own rights, but that we lay down our rights in the service of others. That's the overriding ethic of the New Testament. You don't do what's good for you, you do what's good for other people. You'll see that in 1 Corinthians 8-10 when he's talking about food offered up to idols. You don't go after what your right is, you go after what serves other people better. Romans 14 is the same thing. Philippians 2, he says, your attitude, your mindset should be like that of Christ Jesus, who had the right to divinity, but he laid it aside, taking on the form of a servant so that he could identify with us and pay the price for our sins. And so that's the overriding ethic. So when it comes to the topic of abortion, at the fundamental level, I think the New Testament would say, in general, this is not about anyone's right. This is about what we do to serve others. So if you think in terms of the pro-choice movement, it's very much about a woman's right to choose. A woman has the right to do with her own body. And I think the New Testament would come back and say, yes, but for Christian women in particular, because that's who the New Testament talks to, for Christian women, it's not about your right to do with your body. It's about how do you lay down your rights to serve others. How can you have the mind of Christ, who laid aside his own rights to divinity and took upon himself the form of a servant? So even though the New Testament doesn't talk about abortion directly, the whole ethic of the New Testament is that we do what's best for others. And so I believe that applies to the topic of abortion. I think that in general, Christian women it's not just about fighting for your rights. It's about doing what's best for the life that's growing inside you. Okay, that's just a basic general principle. Incidentally, that applies to everything. That's why, and you've heard me say this many times, when Christians are all about fighting for their rights, that's not a biblical position. It's not a biblical worldview. It's a democratic worldview. It's a Western worldview. It's not a biblical worldview. In a biblical worldview, we lay down our rights to do what's best for the other. So that's the bottom line there on abortion. For Christians, it's not so much a rights issue; it's a service issue. It's a serve one another, submit to one another type of thing. I read an article a while ago by John Stackhouse, who's now a professor in Moncton, Christian professor, and he made a number of points, and I'm going to pull a few of these out to discuss. The first is, of course, that in Canada, we hear people often say, well, this is settled in Canada. It's not really. You may know that since our abortion law was struck down in 1988 through a court challenge by Morgentaler, some of you will remember who are older, then we've had no law in Canada. We're one of the only industrialized countries who has no abortion law. So when, our government, particularly this one, likes to say that's settled law or that's, it's not really. We have no law. So that's important to keep in mind. Also, we get into then another thing we're going to want to get into is a woman's right to do what she wishes with her own body. So I talked about that earlier. For Christian, it's not about rights, it's about service. I believe, as many others believe, that there's life growing in the woman's body when she's pregnant. She's carrying a baby. And so it's not just about her right. There's also the baby's body. And that can get, actually, you can read on this, it gets really philosophically deep to the extent to which a woman has a right over her own body, but there's another body growing inside her. There's an old saying that says, your right to swing your fist stops at the end of my nose. In other words, you can swing your fist all you want, but at the moment you strike me, you lose your right to swing your fist. And so there's a little bit of that going on. So that's one of the questions, of course, that the abortion debate spins on. A woman has a right to her own body. But then many of us believe that while pregnant, there's another body growing in her. And what rights does that body have? That's another piece of it. I always find this one fascinating. And I've heard many pro-choice people say it's just a clump of cells. And yeah, that's true in the first couple of weeks. Really, that's what you have. You have cells multiplying and expanding as God intends. But boy, it doesn't take very long, and it's much more than just a clump of cells. And I find very interesting that and of course there's a lot of extremes on this. Is one of those topics that your passionate pro-choice people and your passionate pro-life people never really see, there's no nuance. It's just yelling extremes. It's fascinating to me that the message you get through the media so often is that it's just a clump of cells. That's when you're talking about wanting to get an abortion. If you've been trying for a baby, as soon as you can get a 3D ultrasound that shows the picture of the little face, you take this precious picture and you stick it up on your fridge and you show anybody, you stick it up on Facebook. So in the one context, it's just a clump of cells because the pregnancy is unwanted. But in another context, because the pregnancy is wanted, this is the first picture of our precious child, enough so that this picture of the clump of cells you're going to take and stick on your Facebook page and you're going to show your relatives and stick up on your fridge. You can't have that both ways. It's either something worth taking a picture of and valuing or it's not. And I find that juxtaposition really unsettling, that we toss that back and forth like that, just a clump of cells because we want an abortion. But if we want the child, then this is, our precious picture of our baby. A lot of people will say, the baby is not really a person. And there's a lot of law being worked out right now about whether or not the fetus is a person. That's tricky business too. One of the things we have to be careful of, there was a time in our history when women were not considered persons, slaves were not considered persons, immigrants were not considered persons, children weren't considered persons. And so you got to be really careful when you get around legal definition of who's a person and who's not a person, because we've actually seen quite a bit of evolution on that in our own legal code. Some people will say, well, Christians used to have, and by that they mean conservative Christians, the far right, as it were, used to have more moderate views. And this is true. This issue seems to have polarized to the place now where there's no nuance left anymore. Some of you will be surprised to learn that Christianity Today, which is the magazine founded by Billy Graham and edited by Carl Henry for many, many years. Back in 1968, which, if I recall correctly, is about 5 years before Roe v. Wade, even Christianity Today came out and said, as Christians, we are generally against abortion. We certainly believe that by the time a life is viable, it should not be aborted. But we understand that there are situations such as rape, or there are situations such as the life of the mother being in danger where abortion may be necessary. Conservative Christians took that position 50 years ago. As Roe v. Wade became a highly politicized issue, it became more fashionable for there to be no give on these topics. In other words, you are against abortion in any circumstances at all times, or you are pro-abortion right on up through to the end of the third trimester. And I think what's needed, and I'm not sure we're going to get there, is a little bit of calmness around this discussion and a lot more nuance. Certainly, for most people, there's a difference in abortion in the first 6 weeks than there is abortion at 36 weeks. But that doesn't seem to be talked about anymore. And I understand that too, because from a Christian perspective, if life begins at conception, then you believe you are aborting life, even if it's not viable. So I do get the foundation for the extremes. I just think the shouting at one another is not being very helpful. Canada has no law at all. Canada could start off by saying, you know what, after the point of viability, which now is 22 or 24 weeks, whatever it is, we are going to have restrictions on abortions. You can't have an abortion for convenience once your baby is viable. If there's a medical issue or other issue between you and your doctor, then there's exceptions for that. We could even start there, but right now we have nothing on the books. The other extreme, of course, is what you're finding now in many places in the U.S., particularly the southern U.S., where they're making it illegal to get abortions for absolutely any reason. They're looking at charging. Texas, I believe, is charging doctors criminally who perform them, charging women who get them. Louisiana was considering a law making abortion the same as homicide, and targeting women who had abortions with homicide. They actually turned back on that. I just think that the great extremes on this are not helping. It seems pretty apparent to me that as a society, and again, the church is not running society, that there is going to be a place in culture for abortion. In other words, women are going to desire abortions, and the government is going to see fit to permit abortions. And it just seems to me that now we're in a pitched battle, particularly in the US, not so much in Canada, that it's either all, like you just can't have the sensible discussion about any limits whatsoever. And I just don't think that's helpful. Of course. And the last point I'll deal with this here before I bring Ryan on. The charge is often leveled at pro-lifers that they are pro-life in the womb only. And I think that's the one that sticks. In other words, Christians will get quite worked up about abortion and quite, pick at abortion clinics and all of this. But then elect folks who restrict access to healthcare and elect folks who restrict after-school programs for children and treat the children of immigrants poorly and all of that. If you're going to have a consistent pro-life ethic, then you probably ought to be pro-life in terms of abortion. You ought to probably be pro-immigration with some wisdom and some controls. You probably ought not to be pro-death penalty. And you probably ought to be pro-gun control because you're pro-life. You want life. So, right now we've got a situation in many quarters where you are, absolutely against abortion, but you're also against immigration and you love the death penalty because interestingly in the US, the people who are often pro-life are also pro-death penalty and pro-gun. So that gets... When culture looks at the church and say, you conservative Christians, you're always yelling about the babies in the womb, but you cut funding for after school programs and you love to see people fry in the electric chair and, you're anti-immigrant and you love your guns. When they look at them and they say, that's really not even a logical position, they're right. And it's certainly not a biblical position. If you're pro-life, then you're pro all of life from conception right on through to the grave. And so, that's just a few thoughts there on abortion. And of course, it's a testament to how much the U.S. impacts our system that I'm talking about this tonight, because there's been rumors there's been leaks at the Supreme Court that says the court might actually overturn Roe v. Wade. And that's interesting. And again, this is something, if you want to educate yourself, this is not just about banning abortion. The question on Roe v. Wade is whether or not Americans have a constitutional right to an abortion federally, or whether or not it's something that states control. That's kind of really the question there, although that question gets lost in the shuffle. So yeah, that's a few thoughts on abortion. It's I am pro-life. I like to think I'm properly pro-life. Um, but I recognize that beating up women who find themselves for whatever reason, particularly in egregious circumstances such as rape or in their own health challenges, beating up on women in culture who are seeking abortions is not helping the church. Screaming at people from sidewalks is not helping the church. It's not helping the kingdom of God. It's certainly not helping that woman. Um, and my sense is that for every woman who has abortion out of convenience, because I don't want to lose my bikini body, or I've got a deposit put down on a cruise. There's also women having abortions who are in really desperate situations. And that to me doesn't condone abortion, but it should give the church pause for thought and say, this is just not all carelessness, and this is just not all casualness and harshness. There are really broken people here in really desperate situations who, with great pain and great tears, are aborting their own babies and feel like they have no other option, and feel there are some who feel like the kindest thing they could do for that child because of their own life circumstance is to abort them. And if ever there were people who the church should come around and show love and grace and mercy, is somebody who feels their own life is so desperately broken that the kindest thing they could do for their own baby is to abort them. But we don't seem to see that. We just think of the person who gets an abortion because they don't want to cancel a cruise. And my sense is that there is an enormous opportunity for the church to do ministry to women and for women who find themselves in these desperate situations. And that might be one of the very best pro-life stances we could take, or actions in terms of being pro-life. Like Amy Semple McPherson, who was an early Pentecostal pioneer, she converted the parsonage into a home for unwed mothers to encourage them to have their babies and provide them with support. And she paired every unwed mother with a widow who had lost her husband, so they would have company, and the widow helped the young mom raise the baby. And she had dozens of women coming in and out of the parsonage. So there are practical ways like that. So this is just one of those topics that I think we just need a little more wisdom and calmness of spirit and more grace and mercy, and step back from this political polarization that many are trying to push us into. Let me see. Thank you, Amy. I love when you do such emotionally charged topics. You have such a calm and measured response. I work really hard at the calm and measured response because I think it's the only thing that's helpful. People are more interested in their anonymity. That's why these rights are ever expanding until on-demand and anonymous is achieved. Dwight, one question I always come back to is this: when does this new developing life have a soul? That's debated. Cody helps us there with ensoulment. There is no consensus. He's right. It's broadly believed by many that it happens at fertilization. You can read a lot about ensoulment. Sometimes the church has believed it's at conception. Sometimes they believe it's at 40 days. It's actually a really interesting study. When does a soul enter the body? Nista says many are also against medical assistance in dying. That's true. That's another great topic we should talk about at some point. Jennifer, I think you hit the nail on the head. Abortion is not a black and white topic. There are many, many reasons for abortions, and it isn't always the case of an unwanted pregnancy. Many people have abortions, have always wanted a child. She feels like it's impossible to be strictly pro-life or pro-choice. Martin says, I don't think there's a perfect solution to abortion that will make everyone happy, but ultimately I think people should only worry about themselves and not worry about what other people choose to do. I get that, Martin. Part of the discussion here, of course, is about legislation, which we have some say in. Nista, thankfully, God's grace is sufficient for those who've had abortions and regret it. That's absolutely true. I feel that Christians are fighting against abortion are fighting on the wrong front. Amy says, if you want to make an impact on abortions, rally for better health care for women, higher incomes so women can afford babies, better access to help for women, excuse me, who leave domestic violence. That's all true as well, I believe. And one more. Cody, thank you for this. Our government has made it very difficult to adopt, painful to foster, and impossible to form an organization like an orphanage in order to care for unwanted or unloved children, which in my opinion is extremely sad. Those who want to help children often think twice when facing the red tape of bureaucracy. This needs to change. I agree with that, sir. I think there is, in terms of advocating, I think the church in Canada in particular could do a lot of good work in advocating for fostering and adoption and better healthcare for moms and help for young moms, and without just yelling about being pro-life. I think there's better ways to spend our energy here. Hi, Andrew. Hope you and Deidre are doing great. I think if the church spent half the time beating up on women who are thinking about abortion and instead spent efforts on supporting women with their choice and navigating life with them in love and actually helping them, we'd be all right. I agree, sir. Thank you for that. Good. Thank you, folks. Another heavy topic, but a necessary and important one, I think. Continue to come here with your comments if you have other things you want to add on that. But now I am going to introduce to the screen my good friend. Let me change my banner over here because I forget to do that all the time. And bring Pastor Ryan Ball, the Bishop of Rocky Harbor.
Good evening. Good evening.
How you doing, sir?
I'm not doing too bad. Hear me okay?
Yes, sir. Got you real good.
I had to relocate to the church. Internet wasn't that strong at the house, so late night tonight.
So it worked out good?
Yeah, it's working good so far.
Awesome. How you been? You've been okay? You're up there pastoring in Rocky Harbor, so you're raiding Gross Mourne. Ryan is a former student of mine, and you've heard me say on this show many times, one of the greatest privileges in my life is when students became good friends, and Ryan is certainly one of them. We're buddies now. I taught him a long time ago. Or I tried to. I worked really hard at it.
Yeah, I was thinking the first time I met you officially was when you picked me up at Pearson, and you were in this big Chrysler 300, this metallic blue color. Picked me up at Pearson, and we had a lot of good lunches, a lot of good trips to Guelph, a lot of good trips looking at skidoos and bikes.
Absolutely.
Thinking about the good things of the Lord and that. So it's
hallelujah. So Ryan, how long you been in ministry now? You've been in Rocky Harbor.
I'll start my 10th year come July.
Wow. So you would be in your early 30s.
31, yeah.
Yeah, you've pastored 10 years now. And so I'm interested in your perspective on this. So the topic, as you know, is lessons for the post-pandemic church. So after 2 years now, we're finally, I imagine in Rocky Harbor, things are just starting in some ways to feel like they're hitting their stride again. What's your sense about how our congregations are doing with all of this?
Yeah, I think when we survey kind of our community was really hit hard with COVID due to the fact that we rely heavily on tourism. And you get 250,000 people pass through Gross Mourne Park every year, and we would see that replicated in our church, during the summer season. Now here in Rocky Harbor, I mean, restaurants are open, hotel is open, tourist business and organizations are, in full swing now, which is great to see. But I think just surveying the congregation over the last little while in our particular church, there's still a little bit of hesitancy leading into this summer season, having such an influx of people.
Yeah.
How long are we going to be, without some of these mandates before they're back again? Will they ever be back again?
Mm.
I think some have struggled with how quick we transitioned. I know we're still in amongst the pandemic, but how quick we transitioned from pandemic to come home year.
Like, stay away. No, by all means, join us.
Yes, and I think that I know for myself personally, I think that we're moving at a rate and a pace that if we're not sensitive to it, I think it can lead to some real struggles for us. If we're not sensitive to the fact that I have to process in January, I was online. I
Yeah.
couldn't meet together. Now, May, we're making preparations for come home year and to welcome people into our province, which is great for the area. But in our church circles as well, there is some hesitancy to that, and there is some hesitancy to, I don't want to speak for all denominations or churches that are represented here, but I think there are just some uneasy feelings of what the next 6 months may look like for us. And I think in some of the conversations I'm having in the community here, it's all the same. We don't know if it'll ever be back the way it was. We don't know if the tourism industry will ever be the way it was. Same with the church for us here in Rocky Harbor. But I'm so thankful for our congregation and for people that have stepped up to the plate and have showed up and showed their support and say, you know what, we're just going to continue to push forward. And our churches really need to be commended for that.
So you're a busy and important young man, and have your ear to the ground. What's your sense of how pastors are doing now, trying to transition into all of this?
Yeah, I think when we look at the pandemic it was a crisis in the fact that we went into high gear. We're pushed through by adrenaline. We've stepped up to the plate. We've gone online. We've come up with creative ways to minister to our communities. And I think our pastors and leaderships and lead teams should be commended for the work of stepping up in the community. But
Yeah.
with any crisis, there comes a period where you look back and you're like, oh man, like I can't believe
Yeah.
I just lived through that. I
Yeah.
can't believe I had a bubble of 10 people that I could only see and
Yeah.
meet with. And I think where I'm to now, leading into the summer and, leading a church with our best friends and other churches in the area, I think I'm starting to recognize more and more that what we went through was a crisis. I feel like I'm left picking up the pieces, and I don't know which pieces to pick up or which ones to leave on the ground, so to speak. And we have to be self-aware of that. We have to be self-aware that like any crisis, whether it's loss, grief, whether it's a traumatic event, there are pieces that will come back to us months down the road, and we'll shake our head and be like, man, I can't believe I lived through that. I can't believe that happened to me. I can't believe that we face these challenges as a church. And I think that's where I can't speak for all, but I think that's where some of our pastors maybe too, not just within our denomination, but across the board. The most recent Barna study said that 42% of pastors they're ready to
Yeah.
throw in the towel, and I
And
think it's
the other thing. Go
yeah,
ahead.
and I think that's because we're starting to realize what we went through and the crisis that we went through, and some of the reminders, daily reminders, that it's okay to realize that we went through a hard time and we've had to make
Yeah.
difficult decisions, and we may have been pushed by adrenaline a lot of the time to put that sermon online or get that message ready or
Yeah.
do a creative event. But I think we're at a point now where we're starting to realize all of that.
And I watch this. A lot of you will know, watching, that my wife's just about to graduate from med school. And when Melinda was facing into a really big exam, she'd ride this wave of adrenaline, right? And she studied, 18 hours a day and very intense. And she'd write the exam, there'd be great relief. And about 2 days later, without fail, she'd say, but I feel sick. And I'd say, that's the crash, right? Because you ride this wave and then it hits and then you crash. And I'm wondering if collectively, certainly in broader culture, but for pastors and even congregations, we're about to hit the crash because, okay, you did your level best, and now we're transitioning so fast from lockdowns and 10 people in your bubble and masks and literally being frightened to death of the person in the pew next to you, which is a weird thing. I mean, we were always frightened to death of some of them because some of them are a bit crazy, but now it's COVID. To embrace everybody, pack her full, and you guys are supposed to hit the ground running when you're all in the crash. I think that's a big piece.
Yeah, and to my, just speaking personally, I think I've started to realize that a little bit more over the last few weeks, as the normalcy of a busy tourist season picks up in this community, right? The boats are back in the harbor and people are back to work, and it's like we've made that quick transition, but we still stop and reflect and say, what we went through was difficult, and we have to be sensitive enough to be able to recognize that,
right?
And admit that it's okay to feel some of the emotions that we feel and know that something is off. I think we have to be self-aware enough to be able to do that. And I'll share this. You like this example, this piece of imagery, but I'm a big NASCAR fan. I watched NASCAR this afternoon. And one of the best drivers that ever was a part of NASCAR, they would say that he could see the wind flow over the top of the car. Like he knew how to take a corner at 200 miles an hour. But I heard a story a few years ago that he went out on the track and he'd done a couple practice laps, and when he was done, he went right to the garage, looked at the mechanics and engineers, and he said, the engine is gone in this car. It's just not going to work. And you got these guys, 6-figure salaries, engineers, mechanics, they're looking at the engine and they're saying, no, man, this thing is fine. This is going to run. You have to run this. And he argued that this is not going to work. He took a crowbar and he shoved it down in the front of the motor where the flywheel is. And he moved the flywheel the thickness of a piece of paper. And if he had raced that at top speed, it just would have exploded and would have been $250,000 down the drain. He knew how that car should handle and perform. The same way as we as pastors and leaders, we know how, in a sense, through the Spirit's leading, how we should be performing. We may not have it all figured out, but we have to identify that, if we feel a little bit off, we should know, and we should be open enough to be able to take a rest. We should be open enough to admit it to others that, I just, I don't know what to preach next week or I'm feeling tired.
Yeah, and our mutual friend Greg Patey took some time off there and has been blogging about it and has written some really good stuff. About having run into a wall and admitting it and saying, I took some time and it's been great. I now see things in perspective, and I've just admired his honesty with that.
And I think our congregations, to that point, I think they want to see a level of authenticity with those in leadership sometimes.
I agree.
A few weeks ago, I got up and stammered through a sermon pretty well and just didn't feel like I was on point where I should be, and shared my heart. And, a gentleman came up after and he said, Ryan, your heart this morning, that was real, and we need more real. We need more authenticity. We need to know that you've had a rough week, and we don't expect all the polish. I know that may not happen in every church. But for me, just having that individual come up who had been in the pastorate to say, that was real, and we need more real. We need more of that heart on the sleeve, so to speak.
So Ryan, when the topic tonight, as you know, is lessons for the post-pandemic church. And so what do you think our lessons, our takeaways are from this? Like, are we ever going to get back to a normal? Should we even be trying to get back to normal? Like, what's the lessons from your vantage point? Is you got a decade in now, which I can't believe. A decade in, and you're still only 31. He's in a rush, folks. He's getting places. So I'm interested in what you see. Like, what do you see as the lessons?
I mean, I don't think there's enough time here tonight to lessons.
Really not.
Speak to where we are here, and I think this would resonate with a lot that are watching. We've been as a church saying, there are things pre-pandemic that worked, and there was things that just didn't work.
Right.
And during the pandemic, you're able to launch new initiatives, new programming, new things that connect within the community. But we had a very pivotal moment, I think, in the history of the church to really analyze where we're to and some things we can make those minor adjustments on. And there are times where we have to prune, we have to cut away, allow for new growth. And that, that's extremely challenging. But the last 2 years have given us some opportunity to do that.
Mm.
And myself and Pastor Courtney, there are a lot of times we just sit down and we just say, no, what have we have learned in the last 2 years that we can build on and we can move forward in? And what are some things that we can just keep pre-pandemic, and what are some things that we can launch coming, in a post-pandemic culture and a post-pandemic church? I think one of the biggest things is that, we have to learn to accept that things may not be exactly how they were, and they're not going to be, but that, the church can be rebuilt, not just to its former glory, but to something far greater than we could ever imagine. And, here we've been working through the book of Haggai for, I don't know, number of weeks now. And just this past week in our study, we just sit back and we're like, man, this is just speaking to us, because, if you read Haggai, you would know that, the Jewish people were displaced. They had faced exile. They're told to return to their land, and they're told to construct a temple, then go about, their everyday life.
Yeah.
And we know what happens. They don't build the temple. They just pour the foundation. And Haggai comes in and says, why are you living in luxury houses and my temple lies in ruins? And
Yeah.
and what he points out that I think speaks to us culturally is he says that you're not satisfied in your living. And he says you eat, but you're still not full. And I can't imagine what that must feel like. But that's his message. You drink, you're still thirsty. You plant, but you harvest little. And he's saying until that temple is rebuilt, and until that temple is started, and that becomes a center focus, you're not going to find any of that satisfaction. So, of course, and you would know this, Brad, they start out with enthusiasm from the top level of leadership down. And they start building, and they realize we're not going to rebuild this to the former glory. Like they're just looking at mud and sticks and bricks, and they're thinking about gold and curtains, and they're thinking about the temple.
Yeah.
And I mean, I just don't see that from a church perspective. I see that in so many different lights, because we may be sitting here today or tonight, and we may be saying that, what, my marriage has fallen into ruins and it's not going to be rebuilt back, or my relationship with my kids, or my small business throughout COVID, or my relationship with God, or my relationship with my neighbor. And I think that we are like the people in this point, that we've come out of a crisis. We've begun to rebuild a little bit, but we are not nowhere near where we should be. We're trying to find satisfaction in all different areas of life. And he's saying clearly, until this temple is constructed, you're not going to find that satisfaction. And when we studied that this week, me and Pastor Courtney, we just said, man, that speaks to where we're to. Because for me, Brad, I look at 2019, and Grossmore Community Church was on rails. Like that was our year.
Yeah.
And we were in our multi-site every week, and we were doing 2 kids ministry programs. Pastor Courtney led 2 VBS programs. We're packing food boxes monthly. We're hitting record high attendance. And like when I look back at pictures now, I'm thinking, man, we're never going to get that again. and now I feel like the Israelites sitting on the foundation, just thinking I'm not going to get back to this, right?
Yeah.
And Haggai clearly relays the message that the most important piece is knowing that God is with you, and that instead of looking at things in the natural realm, we have to understand that God can rebuild any ministry, any marriage, any small business back to his former glory when we understand that he is at the center. And I think that's what's propelling me through. knowing that knowing that God looks at what was accomplished during the pandemic and what was accomplished in 2019, and we're just here just thinking if we could hit those marks again that we hit in 2019. But God is saying, Ryan, I could blow you guys out of the water in what I can do in years down the road. But I think we're at this place where we're just sitting on the ruins and just saying, I don't know if it's going to get back to its former place, its former prestige in the context of which this was written. And but we have to understand that message that he's with us, and that if we look at it in the spiritual piece, that he's going to rebuild far better than what we could ever imagine.
See, it makes sense to me because Ryan Ball sitting in May of 2022, he can picture May of 2019, but he can't picture May of 2025.
Not at all, no.
So you've been through one, but you've not been through the other. So it's easy to look back, which is why we tend to do that and say we'll never match the former glory.
Yeah.
But of course, there's the element of faith, and then there's the element of trusting in the Spirit. But one of the messages I'd want to share is to say, you can actually exceed the former glory, but you've got to be willing to give up what was for what will be. In other words, you have to give up some of what was in the past in order to go where God wants you to go in the future. Like we spend a lot of time looking in the rearview mirror when we need to be looking out the windshield and seeing where we're going. And to get where we're going, we're going to have to give up some of the things that were the former glory. And I think COVID and the pandemic gave us the opportunity to size that up. I'm just not sure everybody is sizing that up.
And it's very enlightening, to sit in that position, and for myself in the way that I'm wired, I want to see 5 years down the road. I really do. And I think that's how
I know it.
Yeah, I think that's how I've done ministry. And when I came out of Tyndale, I had a 5-year plan, and you plan, you work, and you work, you plan, right? So
that's right.
That's how I'm wired.
I heard a wise fellow say that once.
And I've learned, I think, during the course of the pandemic and where I am now, is that I just got to be obedient to the Spirit's leading week by week by week. And that 5-year plan may just be the 5-month plan or the 5-week plan, just with the frailty of where we are in our society and in our world. And, I will caution pastors that I've gone through that over the last 5 or 6 weeks, feeling like the Israelite people of, sitting there with the tools in my hand, the shovel, the pick, and the axe, saying I've gone to get the lumber to rebuild, but I just don't know if it's going to be what it was before. And I've been there, and I think that is a place of self-awareness, to know that you're there and it's okay, but to understand that, like you said, being led by the Spirit in such a way that it can be our ministries and our ministry imprint in this province can be far greater when we live up to where God wants to lead us in this next season of ministry.
So Ryan, here's the question where the rubber meets the road. How do we figure out what things to let go and what things to keep? That seems to me to be the age-old question between pastors and congregations. And as you go in, you try to lead. There's always the accusation that, we're doing things like we did them in the 60s and it's not working. But yet the churches that have just cleaned house, they don't do well either. I mean, you got to keep some stuff. How do you know what to keep and what to let go? How do you figure that out?
I think a key piece of that is the transparency to let everyone see, in the congregation or in the church family or on the lead team, that it's not filling the requirements that it should. And that sometimes when people see that, what, we can make tweaks or we can make adjustments or we can do this better, but it really takes that visionary, that leader, to come in and say, what, we've been doing this for so long. We've been doing the same rituals, the same performance, whatever it looks like. It takes, I think, a visionary to come in and say, to really look at it, analyze it, and say, is it really accomplishing what we need to accomplish. But I think it takes someone as a leader to come in and get everyone on board and have that trust and have that transparency. Because we could come in and as pastors and leaders, or in the corporate or business world, you can come in and make a decision and suffer the consequences of that decision. But when you have the proper education behind that to show people that, look, there's a better way we can facilitate this ministry. There's a better way we can connect with our community. For us here, we had 2 next gen programs. You had a kids program that's K to 6, and you have a youth program that's 7 to 12. And I remember Pastor Courtney coming and saying there's a disconnect, right, in that age group.
Yeah,
we may have to make some adjustments. We may have to change, our ministry performance in this area to meet the needs of our community. And when you get everyone on that same table, and it works easier in a small church because you can get up in front of 30 or 40 people and say, look, guys, we need to prune some things back here in order to have some new growth.
That's right.
But I think it takes someone to be able to stand in that authority to present that vision, and it do take time. And for someone being in ministry for 10 years, in the same place, it do take time to build and foster some of those relationships to get to that place. I look at things that we're doing here now that I'm thinking, man, it took me 10 years to make that decision.
Yeah.
It took me 10
That's
years to even identify some of the giftings within the church to put into work and to put into action. And sometimes I think, man, it seems like a long time to be able to identify giftings in the church, but it really does. And we have to be patient with that. And I know there are some pastors out there that want to push into a new unknown and are probably wanting to fall back on what's comfortable and fall back on what they're used to.
Yeah.
And I think that's a normal. I think that's a normal emotion, a normal feeling that we have of wanting to do what's comfortable and stepping outside of that comfort zone, going into a little bit of the unknown. But I think for us, we need to stand in that authority and the calling that God has given us to say, you know what, we can see where we can be more effective in our ministry and our ministry imprint on our community.
Here's a comment from Cody. Institutions and churches want the best of the best. Pastors with Benny Hinn level charisma, good looks, a good suit, and a Southern Baptist accent. They want top tier preaching abilities that rival TD Jakes, a 24-hour a day on call service with revival in a suitcase. Institutions take the hint. People can't live up to those expectations. What do you have to say to that?
Well, I'm so glad no one had those expectations of me. Where we pastor here, it's a different dynamic. And I've learned over the course of the years that I think what's most valued here in this community for the pastoral staff that is here is our presence in the community.
Describe some of the things you've done in Rocky Harbor and your approach to the community.
Yeah, well, when I first came here, it was a lot of unfocused time. I mean, I came here when I was 20, my early 20s. Ashley was working full time. I had 12 hours a day essentially to do basically what I wanted. There was no push to recreate existing ministries. Basically, it was church on Sunday and a Bible study.
Right.
But I knew that I wanted, and I believe that God desired for me to be the pastor, to be just completely intertwined in the community. And I mean, driving school bus, on the fire department, on the recreation committee, hunting for our community freezer, organizing our community freezer, giving out, 200 moose roasts on a Sunday afternoon. And you just put yourself in a lot of different positions in the community, pastoral care, but that takes time to build that rapport. But what I'm starting to discover now is that people value our pastoral leadership's presence throughout the community. And Pastor Courtney, she's done a fantastic job of doing the same, with the local school and with Western Health and creating, active community living. And I think that when people see us in the community now, it's a natural piece for us.
Yeah.
But I credit it all to driving school bus. I mean, people saw me as just, Ryan Ball, 7 o'clock on a Monday morning going to pick the kids up for school
Yeah.
and getting connected with the school and parents and kids. And today, getting phone calls to be references on, university students' resumes and keeping
Yeah.
those relationships and connections. And I've been fortunate to have the longevity here to be able to see the fruit of that. But now at this season of ministry, I may not be able to devote all of my time to all of those committees, but I have a presence that's been established through that hard work and through some of that sacrifice. And, we've proven it time and time again that when there's something happening here, when there is a need, a spiritual need, that we position ourselves and build that trust and build that rapport with our community. And I think that needs to continue more and more, especially coming into a post-pandemic church culture. That we are here to serve in any way possible. And like I'm so fortunate. Like I can get flown into the hills on a helicopter to shoot a movie for our community freezer and not pay a cent to do it. And be able to volunteer with so many great organizations. I drove tour bus for 2 summers, picking up tourists in Corner Brook and giving them a tour from Corner Brook to Cow Head and do the Western Brook Pond tour with them. And you meet so many great people, and people see you as a piece of the fabric of the community.
That's right.
Pastor Courtney and myself, I think that's been our real push here, and I think that's going to serve us well in the future, because I'm not T.D. Jakes nor Benny Hinn, nor the polished 3-point sermon, or the polished suit and tie pastor, and I was never that. But God knew my specific callings and giftings, and I've been fortunate to be able to work in that environment.
Well, I'll say this for you, to your credit, in front of everybody. You've always had a good sense of who you were, and you stayed true to yourself. In other words, you've not tried to be somebody you're not. And there's a lot of pressure to do that, both for pastors, but also for congregants. Try to be someone you're not, and it's exhausting. It's tiring enough. It's tiring enough to be yourself, but to be somebody you're not is exhausting.
Especially during COVID.
Exactly.
See,
the pressure of COVID, of course, is that we can all see into everybody's churches now for the first time. And that's brought a whole level, because congregants are now looking down the road and going, my glory, they got it way better than we got it. And pastors are looking down the road and thinking, she preaches better, he dresses better, his congregation is bigger, they sing better, look at the nice paint they got. Comparison, it's really a killer, isn't it?
Yeah, it sure is. And comparison, I think, takes our mind off, where we've been positioned to pastor and where we've been positioned to lead. And it's difficult in this season, but I think that it's an area that we can all grow in for sure.
A couple of comments here. Annette, who says Rocky Harbor Church and Ryan are doing so great. The outreach is wonderful. It's a blessing to be a part of it during the summer, and you are quite suited without the suit. I would have to say amen to that. Heather says this is what ministry is all about, being intertwined with the community. Here's a question. There's 2 questions come up. I'll get your take on. Here's the first one. How about post-pandemic lessons for the congregation?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think our congregation needs to be. I think they need to be empowered from leadership down to know that they have a great responsibility in the mission.
Yeah, that's right.
And they have giftings and talents. We talked here this morning about Philip being a table waiter in Acts.
That's right.
And then is led into Samaria.
Yeah.
And he is led into a place, and people follow him because of the joy and the exuberance and the moving of the Spirit. But he started out serving, widows and orphans.
Sure.
And when I look at our congregation in Rocky Harbor this morning, I see I see staff at the hotel, I see school teachers, I see people
Mm.
in healthcare. And we need to continue to motivate that you have to desire to be empowered by the Spirit for mission and witness, and that is our guiding compass.
Mm.
And I know it's easy to replicate in a pastor because that's our calling and that's our job and that's what we've been positioned this community to do. But moving into post pandemic, I think everyone needs to understand that there may be people that we're not able to connect with. There may be circles of family and friends that the pastor doesn't have that relationship or respect built.
Yeah.
Was continuing to leverage, I think, some of the giftings that we have to be able to go into the community. Post pandemic, too, I think for congregations would be to walk alongside their pastors more. And I've had people come into my life and say, you know what, I'm not sure what my specific calling in the church is for this season, but maybe it's just someone that you can talk to.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just someone that there are no to-do lists, there are no checklists. I'm grateful to have people in my life that say, Pastor Ryan, why don't you come in and I'll just listen. And I want to listen to you and I want
Mm.
to pray for you. Um, I'm desiring more in my ministry now to be connected with the people that are there on Sunday morning. More and more as a family and as brothers and sisters in Christ, and to walk alongside us. So congregations, discover what those giftings are, be empowered in the Spirit with those giftings in the community, and walk closely alongside your pastors because they're going to need it. They're going to need it in the next 6 to 12 months, I'm sure.
Cindy says, so much wisdom tonight. Thank you. Ryan is known for his wisdom. David says, I came to visit you in your early years at Rocky Harbor. You made great progress. I did ministry there 40 years ago, and I'm overwhelmed and grateful for your ministry. That's our mutual friend, Dave Crane. Hi, David. Hope you're doing great. Here's a question for you from Elwyn Stacy. Do you think there are some leaders who went from being comfortable to uncomfortable and are so looking back to get to their comfortable position, they'll overlook what they could have learned?
Yeah. That's a great point. I mean, in the normal seasons of ministry, there are things that we can afford to push to one side, and
Yeah.
there are certain situations or differences that we can kind of to push to one side and not give the full attention that they deserve because we're in a different mode of ministry. Right now, coming out of the crisis, which I think we've gone through in the pandemic, we have become more and more placed into uncomfortable situations. We've dealt with a lot of uncomfortable situations as pastors and leaders, and they've been talked about on this show. And I mean, I think right now there may be a little bit of hesitancy dealing with some of these pieces because of maybe some of the reactions that we've had in the past.
Right.
But it's a good question. I'm not sure I totally know how to answer it, but I think even for just outside of the pastorate, in any business, in any corporate, and in any healthcare system, we face uncomfortable situations, and we're a little bit shy now to how we deal with them, afraid of the backlash that we would receive.
Yeah, and if I take a stab at it, the Holy Spirit often leads us, never mind COVID, but the Holy Spirit will often lead us out of our comfort zone into a new place, which is uncomfortable for us. And one of our hopes during COVID is that we were so shaken out of our routines that we would sit back and size up, okay, how should we really, it's a great time to do a reset. How should we really go forward? But I think Elwyn is thinking, human nature is such that we would just like to get back into our rhythms of 2019.
Yeah.
That we might miss some of those lessons. And, for you and I, that's a very real possibility. Nobody likes to being pushed to a place of discomfort, and nobody likes these brand new situations. We like to kind of get back in our rhythms, but it's a real challenge. And thank you for that, Elwyn, to really take some time to sit back and say, yeah, it might be uncomfortable, but some of this might be really good. There's probably some great opportunities here if we can embrace them.
our greatest stages of growth as
Yeah,
well, and being able to identify, you know, getting at the boat and walking on the water, so to speak.
that's right. Um, this is one that I don't know. I know you have limited experience with this, but you've got a lot of peers who do. What do you do when most of your congregation is over 65?
I mean, we're very fortunate to have so many, men and women who have, you know, devoted so much of their lives to church, and now they're in that age group. They're in that age group of 65 plus.
Yeah.
And I think what I've learned over the years is that, they're at a stage in their life now where the pastor really needs to come alongside and still identify some of those giftings. And whether it's just
Yeah.
something small, it still makes them feel a part of the church. And we have
Absolutely.
a couples here in our church that are pushing 80, but yet when something comes around for the kids, if they want to knit socks that we can give out to the kids on a kid night, all for it. If they want to
Mm.
bake something, if they may not be here, present when the ministry is happening, but they're still able to be involved. And I think that we can't overlook the giftings that they have, and just having them involved may not be directly, but through other things that they can do. Another big piece is prayer. And we know that some individuals at this age group are prayer warriors, foundational pieces for our churches,
Yeah.
and is letting them know that they're praying us through some of these difficult circumstances. And that if some have been away during COVID because of COVID sensitivities, that they still have a place in being those pillars in our churches. We know that they've been pillars in other areas of the church throughout our history, um, but most importantly through prayer. But I would say to Carol, I would say, you know what? Identifying some of those giftings, if it's a small task that they can do at home, if they can knit socks, bake bread, if they can, do visitation, something that still shows that they have ownership and value in the church.
That's good. So Lauren has picked up on your comment there and says, really refreshing to hear how a pastor is intentionally looking for gifting in the congregants. Pastors need to do this more. Thank you, Ryan. I agree. Ryan is very good at that. Well, Ryan, as it's almost 11 o'clock in Newfoundland and you've been on deck all day, been a long day for you, and I'm going to Winnipeg in the morning, I'll let you go. Thanks, my buddy, for getting on. I appreciate your time and your wisdom.
No, I appreciate you, brother. And for those listening tonight, if you want to stay in Gross Mourne, you better book now. All of our Airbnbs are filling up. So
Ryan works part-time as a travel agent.
We'd love to see you. We'd love to see you here in Gross Mourne Park after a troubling last couple of years. But it's great to see the great comments there, Pastor Crane. Appreciate you, Cindy. Remember our time together in Tyndale, and Andrew and others. It's great conversation. Appreciate the invite.
Thank you, sir. And speaking of staying in Gross Mourne, go back and read the text I sent you a couple of days ago and answer me, because you never.
I was being led by the Spirit.
Yeah, for sure you are. See ya. Thank you, Ryan, for that. Really appreciate Ryan's time coming on and sharing with us. And that will conclude the show for tonight. Thanks for so many of you for sticking around. It's been great fun to do this again this year. I will pray about coming back on in the fall. But otherwise, I hope you have a great summer. You enjoy yourselves and you stay healthy. And God blesses you real good. Thanks so much for all of your support and the number of you who reach out and encourage me for doing this. And pray God's best and richest blessings on you over the summer. So have a great summer. Take care of yourselves.